Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, CJD. It's like mad cow's disease.
Dear Mr. and Mrs. Churchill, I am writing to express my sincere condolences. Usually I am very articulate, but now I find it hard to find the words to express how sorry I am to hear of Stephen's death.
Well, his lifelong ambition was to become an officer in the Royal Air Force. So that's where he was aiming. All he needed to do was really get through his A-levels, like as of now, and he'd have perhaps been on the way.
He returned to school after last year's summer holidays, and the school thought things weren't quite as they should be. He wasn't achieving what they would expect of him. And we just thought it was Stephen had to work a bit harder, really, and that was the start. The decline was just every day you could see the difference. It never plateaued out, it just got worse and worse. He couldn't walk, couldn't dress himself, he could do nothing, really, at all.
Couldn't feed.
Couldn't feed himself. Found it very difficult to swallow. All the things that we take for granted every day, Stephen couldn't do.
There has never been an unexplained death from this disease in Britain in anyone under 30. The shocking fact is that Stephen's death has made British medical history. There are only about 50 cases a year of CJD. It strikes out of the blue and is a disease which rarely affects people under the age of 50. 17-year-old Vicky Rimmer is thought to be suffering from the same rare brain disease as Stephen. Beryl Rimmer has visited Vicky in hospital for 2 years.
She started shaking. She couldn't hold a cup in her hand, and she was very forgetful. She had loss of memory. The saddest part, I feel, is, you never had a chance to say goodbye to her. I didn't realise when she went into hospital that, that was it. Well, she stopped talking and stopped swallowing and stopped moving all in one day. I don't want people outside to see Vicky, because Vicky was full of life and she was always smiling. It was one of Vicky's trademarks. She had this fabulous smile. And she wouldn't want people to see her as she is, with a feeding tube in her nose and lying there. They didn't know what it was. And I said, I can't accept that you don't know why a child is dying. So then they asked, could they do a brain biopsy, and I gave my permission. And then I was told afterwards that it was spongiform encephalopathy, which I'd never heard of. When I asked my doctor what spongiform encephalopathy meant, he said mad cow's disease.
Doctors cannot say for sure as yet that the disease that has struck down Vicky is CJD. Like Stephen's parents, Beryl Rimmer will not know for sure until after her death.
You keep thinking, where did Vicky get it? Is it my fault? Is it something I've given her? Your brain just keeps going all the time, I wonder if it's, this that Vicky ate. I wonder if it's that Vicky ate. And I don't think you'd ever rest until you find out how she got it and why Vicky.
In the world's medical literature, there has only ever been 3 previously described unexplained teenage cases of CJD since the disease was first recognized in 1921. It's the extreme rarity of this illness in young people that makes Stephen's death and Vicky's illness so concerning.
If they both are CJD, then obviously it's rather worrying to see 2 young people with this disease in Britain when we know these cases are so rare in people of this age.
And when you say worrying, why is it worrying? What do you mean?
Well, anything unusual in relation to a CJD presentation pattern which makes Britain different from the rest of the world might suggest that it's something connected with the BSE that we've had in our cattle. And in that sense, it could be worrying if this is evidence of transmission to humans.
We're really trying to keep an open mind. A lot of people who've come in contact with CJD seem to say it was definitely down to beef burgers, but they don't have any scientific evidence for that. And I think we're both of the opinion that we want proof. It's no use saying things without proof. And so we're trying to keep an open mind.
Our question is it in the air? Are we breathing it? Is it in the water? Are we drinking it? Is it in the food chain? Do you pick it up by touch? We don't know, and there seems to be very little information readily and freely available.
At the heart of this devastating disease lurks a frightening biological phenomenon. It is virtually indestructible. It's not a bacterium, it's unlike any virus. They call it a prion. Once in the brain of the victim, it slowly accumulates, leaving the brain as whole as a sponge. There is no treatment, there is no cure. The disease it causes is always fatal.
This is a picture showing the surface of the brain from a patient with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It shows the cavities that are the holes in the brain that represent the spongiform change which is so typical of this disease. The normal brain would look similar, except there would be none of these cavities at all.
The first prion disease was seen in sheep. It's known as scrapie because it causes the animal to scratch wildly. It is always fatal. BSE is the prion disease that has driven 150,000 British cattle mad since it first appeared in 1986.
A lot of people we've spoken to, they can remember Selwyn Gummer with his daughter feeding her beef burgers at that time, but there was never any scientific proof on the television. So I think we were like most other people, we just continued eating the food that we had eaten for years.
When cattle went down with mad cow disease, we were told a strange new disease had come from the cattle feed made from ground-up sheep. The theory was that many of the sheep fed to cows were suffering from the prion disease scrapie, and that this disease passed from sheep to cows, causing the shocking new disease BSE. When Stephen Churchill was just 12 years old, neurologist Dr. Helen Grant penned a letter to the Times, expressing her fears that the most infective parts of the cow, its brains, were going into our food.
Sir, unless bovine brain is totally banned from human food or is avoided, a new human health hazard hovers over us, potentially far more serious than the various treatable infections we have lately heard so much about. It is the risk of an untreatable dementia. Between the years 1981 and 1989, all of the citizens in the UK were exposed to the infective agent of BSE because the infective material, namely the brains of the cattle and the spinal cord of the cattle, were, until November 89, allowed to be added to what's called meat products, that is, meat pies, pâtés, tinned items and stock cubes. So anybody eating any of those things between those years is theoretically at risk of developing the disease.
I think one of his favourite meals was roast beef and Yorkshire puds. Not a great hamburger eater, beef burger eater, was he? Just
No.
anything really.
In fact, if he had a favourite food, it was probably sausage.
It was around 1981, when Stephen was 5, that cows were starting to be infected with BSE. In 1986, when Stephen was 10, the disease was identified. It was to be a further 3 years, when Stephen was 13, before the government banned cow brains from human food.
Would you agree that this delay itself could have been significant and possibly fatal in the case of Stephen Churchill?
Of course I wouldn't. Quite ridiculous to make that sort of assumption. I mean, you took control measures as soon as there was any reason to do so.
Presumably the regulations were necessary and there must have been a risk.
Well, you use the words at risk. What is true is that the control measures were put in place in 1988 and then extended in 1989, and until that was done, obviously all material from cattle could have been eaten by the human population. But of course, remember, as a time when the incidence of the disease in cattle was relatively low.
A report by a committee set up to look at BSE concluded that it would be unlikely to pass from cows to other species. But worrying evidence began to emerge that this was not the case. In zoos up and down the country, 6 separate species of hooved animals like these oryx and kudu fell victim to the new bug. This was worrying, but not surprising, because they'd eaten the same infected feed that had spread the disease amongst cows. But then came a much more worrying development. It was not the cattle feed this time, but British beef carcasses themselves that caused BSE to pass to a totally unexpected species. First, it was the puma that fell prey to the new prion disease. But again, it didn't stop there. Other big cats also went down. The cheetahs were next. This cheetah was one of 4 struck down by BSE in British zoos. In the early stages of the disease, there is a fine muscle tremor, especially noticeable around the ears. As the disease progresses and the brain turns to sponge, the effects rapidly become more devastating. The animal has lost all sense of balance and developed a distinctive bunny hop. As with all spongiform encephalopathy, the damage to the brain is so great that it is always rapidly fatal. It isn't only zoo animals who get BSE from eating beef products. 68 domestic cats have so far gone down with the disease. The implications were so serious that scientists carried out an extensive search to make sure that this was not simply a disease that had been missed before.
I don't think anybody expected the cat to become the animal which developed a spongiform encephalopathy. It hadn't been seen before. There have been surveys done looking to see whether or not it was seen before, both here at Liverpool and also down in Bristol. The pathologists looked back at their old tissues and had a look to see whether they'd seen it before, and it did appear to be genuinely a new disease when it was first reported.
The ability of BSE to pass from cows to such different animal types concerns many of the scientists working on prion diseases.
Cats are certainly very different to cows, and so it is quite a species jump for it to go from cattle to cats. Also that they have been infected, presumably through their diet. They haven't been injected with prions, they've caught it through what they've eaten. So that is some cause for concern. And it does tell us that BSE is different from scrapie. Certainly cats seem to be very susceptible to BSE, but that doesn't tell us anything about the risk to humans.
If it does affect cats, how can we be sure that BSE will not affect humans?
You can't be sure. That is why we have a CJD surveillance unit which is looking for evidence of any change in the incidence of human spongiform encephalopathies, and that has been running for a number of years and will continue for many years to come.
There seems to be very little information readily and freely available.
Certainly not to parents of somebody who's died of it. Maybe the scientists and the professors of this world talk to each other, but they certainly didn't talk to us at the time, and still haven't.
Nice to meet you. Nice to see you. Sorry about the
Professor Lacey is the controversial Leeds microbiologist who demanded that all herds infected with BSE should be destroyed. He remains a critic.
So what do you think about Stephen only being 19?
I think that is really very important and fairly worrying. And it makes the nature of illness different to this sort of disease in someone in the 50s and 60s and 70s. We have to ask different questions to find the answer. Let's be quite open and honest about it, because the implications of your son's case are so serious. Doctors will be aware of this. They realise it's serious for the whole country. This is very important. They will obviously do their best to find another explanation. And even now, I'm certain there will be people who will try to say, oh, well, it was due to something else. You know, there was another explanation. This is an infection. It's a germ, it's a type of germ. Right. We call it a prion, but it doesn't matter, it's still a germ. And that means you have to get it from somewhere. Yes. Therefore, he must have picked it up, acquired it, And we know the very few ways of actually getting this infection into someone. It looks very much as if, on the grounds of probability, that he ate it. We're going to find out over the next 50 years how many people will go down with this disease. We do not know. We cannot give a figure. There's no way of saying whether it's going to be thousands, or tens of thousands, or hundreds, or millions. Just don't know. I think you've both been very brave about encouraging this sort of debate, and I thank you.
Well, it hasn't needed bravery. We've been driven to it by a 19-year-old son's death.
Well.
Having lived with the disease, having seen the results of the disease, that anyone else should knowingly, willingly be subjected to it is a frightening thought. For large numbers is a terrifying thought.
Still not quite sure. He seemed very extreme compared to the other specialists and scientists we've seen. But maybe he was just a bit more passionate about the subject.
The dairy herd at Mellow Dew Farm was one of the first in the country to be affected by BSE.
Our very first case of BSE was in 1987. We had a home-reared cow. She was about 7-8 years old. She went mad on us one day. We didn't really know what BSE was then, and we didn't see the telltale signs. And then there was one Saturday morning when she just went berserk in the milking parlour. We let her out in the field and she could hardly walk. She was staggering about all over the place.
6 years after his first cow went down with BSE, Peter Warhurst became seriously ill. He was suffering from CJD.
I can remember him as a baby. I nursed him and fed him as a baby. And then to come back over here and see him as it advanced, to see him getting back to that stage. One morning he got him up and put his breakfast there, and he didn't know what to do with it. I had to unfeed him. Well, when you've got to do that to your brother, a grown man, it knocks you. It really knocks you.
After his death, Peter Warhurst's family still work his dairy farm. Like many in the farming community, they remain convinced that BSE is safe and believe that Peter's illness was a coincidence.
There's no connection at all, not in my book. And nobody will make me believe there is a connection. Nobody.
We're still milking cows, doing exactly the same as we were before. What we have talked about is if it is in the feed like they say it is in the feed, when you're climbing around in the lofts, as the feed gets blown into the milking parlour, you have to go up there and shovel it about, and you're breathing the dust in. It's one possibility.
World in Action has learned that in fact 3 people on British dairy farms have died of CJD recently. This is far more than would be expected because the disease is so rare. The significance of these unusual cases is being studied by the official CJD monitoring group.
And we found that although there is an apparently increased risk in farmers, there's also an apparently increased risk in other occupational groups, including vicars and professional drivers, in which there is no biological suggestion of any link with BSE.
The link, though, is striking in the case of dairy farmers, isn't it?
Yes.
Does it not give you cause for concern?
Yes, it does give me cause for concern, and that is why we've been so careful to try and investigate these cases and investigate the whole issue of occupation both here and in collaboration with our colleagues in Europe.
I guess some reassurance has been that individuals that might be at high risk as a result of their occupation from developing BSE, should that happen, would be, for instance, abattoir workers. And we're now more than 10 years on from the earliest stages of the BSE epidemic, and if we were going to see cases, we might have expected to have seen some in that occupational group, and we haven't. So that is some reassurance.
I remain confident that we won't see an epidemic in humans. However, you cannot be 100% sure. I'm reassured by the fact that the figures of Creutzfeldt-Jakob are still static. I'm reassured by the absence of cases in abattoir workers. But I think we won't really be certain that there's no transmission to humans from BSE for perhaps another decade or so, given the incubation periods of these types of diseases.
Part of the reason that so little is known about the causes of CJD is because the disease has such a long incubation period. Stephen could have contracted the disease at any point in his life. The incubation period could be between 5 and 30 years.
In the unlikely event of BSE causing disease in the human population, this might have a very long incubation period. And I think although the data we have so far does not indicate any major change, it is far too early to say with certainty that no such change will occur, although my personal opinion is that I think it is very unlikely that such a change will occur in relation to BSE.
Stephen grew up with his sister Helen, who is now a 21-year-old dental student.
He was my brother, and I'd like to know why it was him. When they say it's got such a long dormant time that, you know, anybody could be at risk. And maybe I did eat what he ate and I won't know for years.
We might have all done that.
Exactly. But, you know,
Which is one of the reasons,
it's always at the back of your mind.
It's one of the reasons that perhaps we need to know to take that fear away from us, just as a family.
And I've got no scientific reason for it, but just I can't eat beef
Just can't
anymore.
face it.
No, I just can't swallow it, or I would rather go hungry, I think, than have beef now. Nobody seems to be able to give you a straightforward answer on that, do they?
No, because we've had every end of the spectrum, haven't we?
Yeah.
We've had it is and it isn't.
So I don't in a way know how the government or the Ministry of Agriculture can say that beef is perfectly safe for people to eat, because we can't find out the answer to that.
I can say that personally I am convinced no scientist is ever 100% sure of everything, or at least no reputable scientist is ever 100% sure of everything. But I personally am absolutely convinced, and my conviction, if you like, is demonstrated. Not only do I eat the stuff perfectly happily, but I'm very happy for my children and my grandchildren to do so as well. And if I had any doubts, I can assure you I would do something about the grandchildren. I have no doubts.
It's been since we started this quest that we've started to learn more and more about the subject and more about the difficulties of the subject.
I don't think it's as easy, the answers, as we thought they might be at the beginning. It's a lot more involved, and we've got a lot of knowledge now, but we still haven't got any answers. So we've now got to continue and look further.